All right, welcome to Is It In Yet? Where probably the only thing cringier than the actual news and what's going on in U.S. politics is this show. I'm Steve-O, and joining me, of course, is U.S. news enthusiast and InfoWars fanatic, Brian.
Yeah. Real quick, how is U.S. news associated with Alex Jones?
It's not. He handles U.S. news.
Is U.S. Oh, okay. Are you talking about U.S. news as a general thing? I thought for a second we were talking about like a blog or...
Well, InfoWars is...
All right, I don't know anything about what you're actually talking about. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's a bunch of garbage. I don't listen to InfoWars. I don't know what Steve's talking about. That's all I have to say about that.
All right, great. Trying to introduce a little bit of comedy into this podcast.
Well, you're not funny, so it doesn't really work out.
Fair enough. Coming up on the show, we are actually going to be introducing a new voice. We'll give him a chance to talk a little bit about himself, and then, as I like to call it, really rather argue his case as to why he deserves to be on this podcast. And then from there, we're going to dive deep into conspiracies, specifically Flat Earth, one of my favorite topics right now.
All right, yeah. So this is a topic that I pretty much know almost nothing about, to be completely honest. And we'll get into this, but Steve wanted me to watch a documentary yesterday. I watched this documentary. It was somewhat interesting. And so I started looking up reviews about the documentary, and I actually spent time this morning listening to a Flat Earth podcast as well.
Oh, nice.
So I've got some education now, or at least some information on the topic. But yeah, you've been interested in this Flat Earth stuff for quite a while. Years, maybe, at this point? I don't really know.
I don't know. I dive deep into conspiracies, man.
You are?
I love conspiracies, and I don't believe 90% of what I get into, but I don't know, man. I get into just, like, the people aspect, the community, some of, like, the most ridiculous shit you've ever heard of. And I saw this documentary, and I know you and I have at least like kind of talked jokingly, and so has our third voice. Him and I have talked about it, but so I thought, oh, this might be like the perfect time. I saw this documentary appear on Netflix, so it's fairly recent, and I thought, this is perfect. I'll make these guys watch it, and then we can like discuss it. But that was one side of my brain. The other side, after I finished it and told you guys to watch it, was like, I kind of feel bad that I'm making these guys watch this thing, because it is, I don't know. We'll get into it. But maybe, I guess, without a better segue, we could introduce now our third voice here, John Abuch, which you might hear us call him a bunch of different things. His name is John.
The UK
we have a bunch
sub.
Of different the UK sub. John.
SLC
Baby
Punk.
Boomhead.
Gus. So basically, if you don't hear someone specifically talking to Steve or Brian, you know we're talking about John. So welcome to the show, John.
Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this interesting experiment you guys are conducting here.
Pull your mic closer to you, bud.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk some Flat Earth.
Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself? You be as discreet or as descriptive as you please.
Well, I will say, going back to the Alex Jones conversation, I once upon a time did indulge in his show somewhat frequently, just purely for entertainment value. Listening to somebody talk about conspiracy theories and 9/11 truthers and all the reputable news sources that he gets his information from, and all the high-level FBI and CIA executives. It was entertaining stuff.
I mean, you and I have talked conspiracy theories before.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's fun to dive into. It is, whether it be UFOs or government cover-ups or flat Earth. In the case of this discussion, it's interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think you're the same as I am in a lot of ways, where it's just like you might not believe a whole lot. I actually don't know what either of you two believe, if you don't believe any of the stuff. But obviously, there's a few things out there that we could get into one day that I find interesting and might be more on the side of believing certain conspiracies, but more times than not, it's just fun to like dive into, you know?
I agree. And I think that's part of, I'll say, one of the interesting ways this conversation can go too, is even in the conspiracy theory world, there are, I'll say, nuggets of truth sometimes buried in there in different places. I'll say these conspiracies, while they're, at least in my opinion, not real, there's sometimes things in them that you could look at and say there might be a piece of that could be legit, and I think that makes the makes it more intriguing, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, for me, it's a lot of like, sometimes you see something and you just have no interest in it at all, or you just kind of laugh and you're like, oh, that's kind of a fun story. But for me also, there's certain things I've watched where I honestly, like, I know nobody can see it, but it's like you're watching it and all of a sudden you kind of raise an eyebrow and you realize, that's kind of interesting. Like you kind of just connect these dots, not necessarily because you want to, but if you're looking at something objectively, sometimes you do kind of raise an eyebrow and you're like, like there might be something to that.
Well, I mean, I think probably so there's always something to a story, right? Especially if it's going to turn into something that really becomes entrenched in one's worldview. There's always something that makes some sort of logical sense or clicks to some degree. It's kind of a question of really, what is this clicking with, or what is this attaching to? It's very rare that you have something come just completely out of left field that just instantaneously changes your worldview, right? So one of the things that kind of got brought up in that documentary a lot was this idea that it was kind of like a slow process for a lot of these people. And I mean, that's because it starts as something that a little bit of information that seems anomalous, and someone else comes along and says, well, why is this anomalous? And then, it can start snowballing from there. And we can talk about why it snowballs, how it snowballs, whichever way you might want to take that. But I think, for stories in general that mean something or that become highly valued, there's typically some sort of grounding somewhere that attaches and we can say, has some sort of merit to it. How much merit, whether that merit stands up to scientific scrutiny or true rigorous logical inquiry, well, that's a different question. But to just say that there's something there is, I think, kind of almost obvious to a certain degree.
I definitely think there's an interesting point in that too, because I think especially after watching this documentary and kind of thinking about how to proceed in discussing flat Earth, I felt like there was two different conversations that could be had about it. One could be the scientific kind of let's see let's use all the scientific evidence we have to disprove why the Earth is flat, or disprove what their beliefs are. Which to me, not to say that's not an interesting conversation, but I think one of the things that you mentioned is kind of the avenue that my head goes into is, why is it that these people can form these beliefs off of that, like you said, that kind of small nugget of truth. In addition to that, to me, I think kind of looking at the communal aspect of it, that at least, the documentary that we watched kind of just, portrayed too. To me, that was equally as interesting as the scientific evidence that they use to back up their claims.
So really quick, before we go any further, I think it would be best if one of us just kind of give a brief synopsis of the documentary, and then we can go from there.
All right, Steve, I think that is your area.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So the documentary, which recently was put on Netflix, I'm not sure when, it's called Behind the Curve, and it is all about basically the flat Earth community. It's specifically centered around one specific person. His name is Mark Sargent, who people have called, and I don't know who people are yet, so we'll probably break that down further, but people have called him, and he himself had mentioned that like he is referred to basically as like the father of flat Earth. So it's mainly following him around. Also, a woman named Patricia Steer, who does like a podcast. I believe her and Mark do. I don't know if they do a podcast together or if he's just a frequent guest, but either way, she does like this conspiracy theory podcast, and a lot of it is centered around flat Earth. And then, of course, it introduce various other people who might be considered like flat Earth influencers in the community. But surrounded is like this whole community of flat earthers following Mark Sargent into what was also the first ever International Flat Earth Conference, which was held first in 2017 in Raleigh, North Carolina. And they've held a bunch of conferences since. And I know, actually, honestly, John and I were serious. Well, I don't know if you were serious, but I was
semi-serious.
Dude, I was all in. Like, we were talking about actually going to the last one, and then, you know, some things happened in my life where that just wasn't possible at the time. But anyway, that is... Oh, hey, really quick. Sorry, this is not a part of the podcast, but I figured out why my mic was being a bitch. All right, that's better. Whoa, holy shit. Fan-fucking-tastic. Okay, so anyway, that's basically the entire premise of the documentary. And I guess to start it off, kind of like what you guys were talking about, what I found kind of interesting about it is really, you know, for one reason or another, it didn't really get too far into like the actual kind of theories behind flat Earth, or honestly why people started believing at least like the physical and scientific aspects of why the Earth is flat. It focused a lot more about the community, which I also think has a lot to say about this specific subject. So just because I don't know how much you guys know about this, but a lot of what I have read or seen is that this whole rise of flat Earth believers really kind of came from what a lot of people believe was like a troll off of, I believe the website was 4chan. It's either 4chan or Reddit, which I think 4chan makes a lot of sense to me because that's just where a lot of notorious like memes and trolls are born. So now again, you know, you might talk to a flat earther and they'll probably say like, well, that's what they want you to believe, you know, right? That's what like the globe earthers are saying to try and like, again, make us seem less serious than what we are. But as far as I understand, it started off kind of as like this huge troll that grew into this movement. Now, Mark Sargent, from this documentary, as you see, there were other people kind of like talking about flat Earth. And as we know, I mean, flat Earth is not necessarily something new to like the whole idea of how, you know, the Earth, but it is something now that has developed this huge community and following. I mean, the flat Earth society was actually founded here in Ohio. Like, I don't remember how long ago, but there have always been people on the fringes that have stuck to this idea that the Earth is flat. You just typically didn't hear about them until what I believe anyway now has become like, now that people have a platform like the internet to express their ideas, you know, it didn't become this big until recently.
I agree. I think, to be honest, my kind of initial introduction into, I think, kind of the flat Earth world was in part due to former Cavaliers point guard Kyrie Irving saying that he believed that the Earth was flat. And I mean, and I know that sounds somewhat ridiculous because, again, that it's not to say that this community hasn't been out there throughout all this, but it was, I think, definitely more of a fringe a fringe group of people, and then they were able to get notoriety, whether it be through internet message boards or YouTube commentators and things like that. And then I think it kind of stemmed into a world where you did see some more prominent names, like I said, Kyrie Irving being one of them. I believe there was a rapper additionally who had said that he was a flat earther. I think it was B.O.B. was his name. But I will say,
he had a beef with Neil deGrasse Tyson, didn't he?
Yes, I believe he did. Yeah. If I remember, I think it had something to do with him being able to see the tops of skyscrapers from his apartment and saying, how would I be able to see those if the earth was round?
Yeah. And there's also a still disputed comment that Shaq made, Shaquille O'Neal, as well, where half the people say, oh no, he's definitely a flat earther. The other half say, because if you know anything about Shaquille O'Neal, he's kind of a jokester too. So the other half say like, oh no, he was just being silly. But he also made a comment sometime later on a podcast where he said something to the effect of like, hey, all I'm saying is that like I drive from like Los Angeles to wherever all the time, and all I'm saying is it's flat all the way. Right. So a lot of people jumped on that one too. But the point is, it gave, whether he believed it or not, whether any of these people believed it or not, we have celebrities jumping on to that bandwagon and they're creating a platform. Right. So it's giving attention to something regardless. And I guess one of the reasons, too, that I wanted you guys to watch this documentary, even though I'm going to be honest, it didn't really touch on a lot of the things that I hoped it would for us to talk about, which is all of those like deeper conspiracies about the actual physics of flat Earth and stuff. It was the first actual documentary I've seen on Netflix or on any sort of like actual broadcast thing. Like there's a bunch on YouTube that you can watch. If we ever talk more about this subject, maybe I can give you guys a few others that are just absolutely ridiculous. There's other theories too, of course. There's convex Earth, which we could get into one day, but I don't want to stray too far.
And I have no idea what that is.
We're still working out some mechanics of the show. I don't know if this is going to end up in the show, but one important thing to note is that, again, we've mentioned that Brian and I are recording in two completely different places, and today of all days, the wind is fucking crazy right now.
It is insane.
I don't know if you're going to end up hearing a bunch of wind in the background. It seems to have calmed down a little bit, but just
I can't hear any wind.
Well, that's good. That's good. It seemed to have calmed down right when we started this podcast, which may be a sign, guys, that people want to hear this. Maybe God sent us a sign that this podcast is like the voice.
Sounds like another conspiracy theory to me, Steve.
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think God would probably want us to talk about how awesome flat Earth is, not about how skeptical we are about flat Earth.
Right.
Well, yeah, a lot of people who are drawn to flat Earth are religious flat earthers. So that's a good point.
Well, I mean, it fits better with the worldview that they already have, derived from, scripture. I mean, specifically, obviously, we're talking about the Abrahamic or Judeo-Christian tradition. But yeah, it's just that kind of a model, that kind of a description of the world, it's an easier fit into their already extant worldview. So, I mean, obviously, if you have a worldview that is more amenable to this kind of idea, it would be easier to kind of adopt that idea.
And to be honest, I was somewhat kind of thrown off by that, because I know in the documentary they definitely kind of pointed that out in terms of, I think there was one gentleman specifically who talked about how the dinosaurs weren't real, or the Earth was only so many years old. And I never, at least in my own I wouldn't necessarily call it research, but my own observations into that kind of community, I never made the connection that there were any real connections between that. I didn't think that flat earthers didn't adhere to any kind of, I guess, standard religious beliefs. Not that that it's something that's kind of blanket across the community, but I didn't necessarily make that kind of jump that flat earth fit into that realm or fit into the religious ideologies of some of the tenets to it.
There is one interesting part in the documentary, and I know, Brian, you texted me about this last night too. Like, there are actually some flat earthers out there who try to perform actual science experiments.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this interesting thing that happens in the documentary where they're interviewing an actual physicist and a psychiatrist and like a science writer. And while that's going on, there's another guy talking about an experiment that they're doing with a gyroscope. And I'll let Brian jump in here in a few minutes because I'm sure you paid extra close attention to these experiments, Brian. But the point that I want to make is, like, they're going back and forth between like these actual scientists and like some of these people from the flat earth community performing experiments. And one of the things that's happening in tandem is this guy is explaining this gyroscope experiment, and the first few times that they try
hold on. I just want to stop you real quick. I think what you're trying to get at when they were speaking with the science writer, and they were jumping from the science writer to the experiment being done by the flat earthers. That wasn't the gyroscope experiment. They were actually doing a light experiment. So they were doing light travels in a straight path. So what they were trying to do was basically set up 3 different stations where you shoot a beam of light, and basically they did some calculations. Okay, if the Earth is flat, the light should be appearable at 17 feet on the opposite end. So you have ends A and B. On end B, you shoot a beam of light. On end A, you have an instrument to measure the incoming light, but you have it set up so that it will only capture the light if it's at 17 feet. So if it's at 17 feet, then you should be, the Earth is flat, right? If you shoot the beam on side B at 17 feet, then on side A, you should, if you see the light,
it should be exactly the same.
Right.
level.
It should be 17 feet. You should be good. Boom. Earth is flat. Of course, the problem was that if they, from their own mathematics, granted, right? If the light beam had to be shot from 23 feet to be able to be seen from B to A, that would mean that the Earth actually has curvature in the way described by, whatever you want to call it, standardized science.
So really quick, so the one thing that I just wanted to point out, just to wrap up what I was saying, is that the interesting thing to me that John was also getting at is like, so John started talking about like, Earth is flat, but also that gets into a lot of the mistrust in the community of what authority figures or presented authority figures tell us. So also, in order to kind of complete their narrative, other things surface too, such as dinosaurs never existed. So the point that I kind of wanted to make is like this parallel between the science experiments that are happening by flat earthers with the supposed experts in the scientific field, is that what you end up seeing is that in order to complete the narrative, rather than accepting evidence at face value, you continue to write new things into this story, right? To explain these anomalies. So the point is, the reason I brought up the gyroscope mainly is because what I remember from that is like they tried it a certain way, it did not match their narrative, so then they added an extra part to it, encasing it in something, and then it still gave them the same results. And so again, they are planning on trying it a third way. Now, of course, at the same time...
Hold on. I just want to... So we started a particular point, and then we kind of started going in all kinds of different directions. Let's just, let's finish the one point that you were originally starting. Jumping back and forth between the science writer and the experiment being performed by the flat earthers, right?
Okay, no, that's fine. The main point that I'm trying to make is that it seems like this is the problem is that it only kind of goes against like the scientific method because you continue to basically, rather than accept kind of like the data that you're given, you're reverse engineering, or you're adding more things to kind of further support your narrative, right?
Right. So
it's like it's a fantasy. I mean, I'm just gonna be honest and say it, like, because
okay, you could call it a fantasy. I would call it a faulty explanation, or an ad hoc explanation. But again, I'm sorry. Let's just wrap up what it is that we're talking about, right? Because we're assuming that if anybody is listening to that, those individuals might not have seen the documentary. All right. So the scenario that we kind of want to talk about is that there are experiments that were being performed by people in the Flat Earth Society that were documented in this documentary. There were two experiments in particular. Don't
call it society either.
Sorry, community.
No. I just just call it community. We can get into that later. But anyway, go on.
Oh, okay. The first experiment we'll call a gyroscope experiment. The second experiment we'll call the light beam experiment. The interesting thing with the light beam experiment is what you were kind of talking about initially, is they were going back and forth between a science writer and what the Flat Earth Society was doing. They explained, that is, the documenters explained to the science writer what the flat earthers were trying to do. And the science writer said, oh yeah, well, if they do that, they're going to be in for a surprise, right? I think they're going to be not very happily surprised when they find out their results, because this, as it was explained to the science writer, that sounded like good science, right? So you flip on over to the Flat Earth Society. They perform this experiment. Again, they said at 17 feet, if it's flat, we should see it. Did not see it at 17 feet. At 23 feet, if it's curved, we should see it. They rose it to 23 feet, and they were able to see it. So again, it seemed like the good scientific experiment was kind of debunking their own theory or debunking their own idea. The same kind of thing happened with the gyroscope experiment, where you had a gyroscope. It was supposed to measure the spin of the Earth at a certain degrees. If it spun at 15 per hour, then that would suggest the Earth was actually a globe or spherical. That was the result they got. And then that gets into what you're talking about now, where they tried to come up with ad hoc explanations, where they were saying things like, well, maybe it is the pressure of the heavens on the gyroscope that's making it do this and all of that stuff.
Right.
Really quick, and John, I know you want to say something, so I just want to add to that. On one end, I do not... I respect the fact that they're at least kind of utilizing the scientific method in the sense that, like, we are taught from the very beginning that it's like the whole reason we believe what we believe is that we can test certain things, and if we do it the right way, a la the scientific method, then we should be led to a conclusion. So in that respect, I'm glad that there are some people within that community who don't just believe something and also just use like their own observations. They try to test it. That being said, like what Brian also just pointed out, is that where it becomes a problem is if they test it and test it and test it and they continue to get the same type of results over and over again, rather than at some point just saying like, well, we have to admit then this isn't right, they continue to make up pieces of their they continue to make up new narratives to add to their story as to why it's not working in their favor.
No, as I say, and I think this is kind of a sidebar to kind of this part of it. And I think it was something that the documentary did relatively well. And I think it's an important point in terms of, at least the way that I kind of frame the documentary, is that, excuse me, when it comes to a lot of, I think, conspiracy theory type movies, they a lot of times betray the people who adhere to these conspiracy theories as, you know, stupid, or that they lack intelligence, or whatever it might be, which I feel like this documentary did not do. And I say that in a positive way, because I think it shows, and going back to even kind of the scientific experiments, that even people who do have an understanding of science and do have an understanding of the scientific method and how to validate hypotheses and different things like this can get sucked into these beliefs and get sucked into, you know, these, I don't know if I'd call it an ideology, but I think the ideologies can kind of fall into that same trap, where these aren't people who are any different than anybody else. They just adhere to a certain set of beliefs, and they try to make the world fit those beliefs, as opposed to trying to see if the world, or, you know, if physics or science or whatever, you know, what have you, actually, you know, I wouldn't say agrees, but finds those beliefs to be true. And that was something that I thought the documentary did extremely well.
Yeah, and they if you remember, there is a certain point in the documentary where one of the scientists, or it might have been the science writer, but like, they all kind of unanimously agreed that, you know, it's easy when looking at a movement like this for some of us to look at it and go, these people must be stupid. But they say themselves that in order to kind of like create this new reality, there has to be some intelligence behind it. So it's really not the fact that anyone is stupid. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember what word the one guy used, but I think he said something like perhaps miseducated, but not stupid.
Right.
Because they're using the mere fact that you're coming up with ideas like these, and then also, even though it's not part of the scientific method, you're coming up with new ways to explain or dispute what we've been taught. Like, there's intelligence behind that. Mm-hmm. You have to be somewhat smart to be able to kind of like create these new narratives, again, I'll say. So it has nothing to do with stupidity. If anything, possibly miseducation, or what I personally think is just the state of the world right now. It seems like a lot of people have a lot more mistrust these days for authoritative figures. Mm-hmm. You know?
And I think a big part of it too is that I think clearly, and if you look at, you know, I think the main people that the documentary is highlighting, there's a reward in holding these beliefs, and in terms of like the community that they work within. You know, if I believe even when they were at the Flat Earth conference, you know, they have people talking about how they know that if they were to change their beliefs on this, then they would be exiled from the community. They'd lose their friends. They'd lose their, you know, they lose the people who they've, you know, built these positive relationships with. And I think that's another interesting part about it. And, you know, I don't want to say that, you know, in the more mainstream scientific community, things like that can't happen. I'm not part of that community, I would say, so I don't know. But to me, I feel like that's one thing that very much goes against any kind of scientific inquiry, is the idea that if what you believe goes against what I believe, and then you're exiled from it. And there's, like I said, there's a reward for holding the beliefs. It's, you are allowed to continue to be part of this community, and, you know, for some of them, not only be a part of it, but be a poster boy of it. You can be the person that they look up to, that they look at as the, you know, the father of flat Earth. And it's I think it's this very interesting kind of social dynamic to see.
Yeah, and I would so I want to say two things about what John just talked about. Completely agreeing with John 100% on this, except for I would say that I do believe that we have, in the history of science, some evidence to suggest that there are times when mainstream science pushes out fringier ideas or whatever, or ostracizes certain ways of thought. Fritz Zwicky, was that his name? I can't remember his name. I can't think of the particular guy's name. This is terrible academia or scholarship on my part, but I think there are some examples in history to suggest that sometimes the mainstream does push out the fringier ideas. Does it happen in the kind of way that was kind of portrayed in that community? No, I don't think so, but I mean, it does probably happen. The other thing that I wanted to say is kind of just talking about the community in general. I agree with John. I think that really the merit or the real kind of drawing force for flat earth beliefs seems to be the kind of community aspect. And I think that the three of us could, to a degree, sympathize with belonging to a kind of fringe or a socially ostracized kind of community, just considering that we grew up in a rather conservative area. We were all punk rock kids that kind of eschewed a lot of those values at an early age. And we kind of identified with a group of people who, let's be honest, the music that we played was kind of, in terms of talent, not the most talented music, right? Punk rock music isn't built on being talented really in your instrument or in your vocals, at least in a classical sense. But the sense of community and the sense of shared kind of brotherhood and sisterhood and just, friendlyhood, however you want to portray it, was very, very strong. And it's really that community, at least for me, that's the thing I think about the most. The music is kind of second. It's kind of tertiary in a sense, right? It was the community that really makes me nostalgic when I think back. And it kind of, when I was watching that documentary, that's kind of what I was thinking of, is here are these people. They're not dumb in any way, since I mean, they don't seem dumb. I mean, just having the documentarians having just conversations with these people, you could tell they're not dumb. Their IQ is not zero, right? They are not stupid people. But at the same time, it seems like it's part of this community to buy into this ideology. And if you don't buy into this ideology, you're out. And then where are you? Kind of what John was saying.
Here's one of the things that, and going back to that point, and obviously, one of the terms that I think is pretty frequently used in kind of our society as a whole is the idea of echo chambers, and how once you get kind of stuck in a certain belief system, you start to follow people who adhere to that same belief. So it's more difficult to get views that challenge your perspective. One of the things that I thought might be an interesting question, and part of this, it might be disconnected to the flat earth topic in and of itself, but maybe some of the other topics that they brought up. The specific one I'm thinking is the anti-vaccination piece of it, which I think kind of was discussed, not in deep.
Yeah, but someone made a comment at that flat earth conference.
Right. And I guess my kind of question that might be an interesting way to go is there any, do you think that these belief systems pose any, not existential threat or anything like that, but any dangers, or they can have side effects that could potentially be more dangerous to the people that are not within that community? And again, I use the anti-vaxxers as an example of that, because there is a possible external threat to that. If people aren't vaccinating their children and they get some polio or something like that, they do have the chance of infecting other people with that, whether they're part of that that community or not. So I guess, do you feel like flat earth in and of itself could potentially have any external dangers, or not necessarily dangers, but external impact on society as a whole?
I don't know. See, that's a great question. That's a question I actually have not considered in regard to flat earth. I mean, obviously I would agree with you on the anti-vax movement. That's obviously got an existential threat to it. But flat earth, I don't know if flat earth has at least an overtly existential threat. I think maybe, just spitballing here, kind of going off the top of my head, it seems more like there's a threat to progress in flat earth, where if you're going to adopt a model that's blatantly not true, and then you're going to build future projects off of that model, well, if the project you're working on is utilizing an incorrect model, then you're not going to accomplish your goal. You're not going to accomplish the thing that you want to do. So let's say, okay, let's just imagine we want to go into the firmament or into the heavens or whatever you want to call the sky, right? We want to try to shoot something up there, okay? Well, if you don't buy into gravity, for example, right? If you don't want to do any sort of calculation for the effect of gravity, you're going to have a real rough time accomplishing anything at great distances, right? Now, I know they don't believe there are great distances there, so they might not care to try to send something as far as they can straight up into the air, or however they might conceive of it. But, I mean, there is a real sense in which this could be problematic for our understanding, not just in a sense of academic understanding or in a sense of, the search for truth, but in a real sense of kind of technological progress. Because again, like, you have a lot of technology that is based off of Newtonian physics, that's based off of Einsteinian mechanics. We have stuff that's built in this world that's based off of quantum theory. Are we going to disregard all of that in favor of the flat Earth model? And if so, what happens going forward, right? I mean, there's no clear path to what happens going forward, and I would assume that the projects that would be proposed, the projects that would at least benefit us technologically, those would be severely hampered by a flat Earth model.
And I think that's an interesting kind of perspective on it too, because I think especially when you look at the technological advancements that have come from, the more mainstream scientific beliefs, or like you said, how Newtonian physics has kind of led to different scientific advancements and things like that. There's also been financial backers who are willing to fund money into researching those topics, and I think traditionally what you'd end up see happening is that good ideas would continue to grow because there would be a push for more technological advancement in these areas. So people, or companies, or governments would say, we want to know more about this because we can see that these theories are producing things that are beneficial to society as a whole. One of the things I think that is interesting, and again, I think that the end of the documentary kind of touches this, is that because the community is growing so significantly, that they are getting financial backers to research these things. And they are having people who are funding money into doing these different research endeavors and things like that. And again, not to say that, again, there's bad intentions or anything like that, but to me, it obviously could be better well spent on other areas. But it's extremely interesting to me to know that there are people who are willing to throw money, whether it be individuals or crowdfunding and things like that, into pushing things that aren't producing technological advancements that are beneficial to anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a legitimate concern to have for any sort of, I don't want to call it a disinformation project, but that's a legitimate concern to have for anyone who cares about trying to, let's say, how do I word this in a way that, so I would say that it's a legitimate concern for anyone who is trying to reach a semblance of truth that has both testable accuracy and also just pragmatic utility at the same time.
Can I throw my 2 cents in here to John's question?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay. So first off, what I want to say is I think in the grand scheme of things, this movement will not harm scientific progress overall. I don't believe that because thinking just about the advancement of science and history throughout the ages, there's nothing really that I can see where that sort of thinking has impacted us on a, sorry, flat earthers, a global scale that has set us back in
What do you mean?
advancement.
Wait. Just be explicit about that, because I might have a counterexample.
Okay, well, I think basically I think where the danger of flat earth comes into play kind of touches on something you guys were mentioning. But I think it impacts us more on a level of maybe possibly harming someone or something specific versus the overall, like taking the utilitarian perspective here, Bri. I don't see in an overall the overall scheme of things this impacting scientific advancement, but I do see some definite harm within that community.
Okay, real quick.
All right, just don't let me forget, because I want to finish my thought.
Okay, well, you go ahead and finish your thought, then I'll come back.
Okay, so really what I actually see where I could see this being harmful is much more kind of on a localized level. So one of the most softcore versions I could basically give, and then I'll give a more extreme example, but like the softcore idea is like, so because this is a new movement, right? We have people around our age getting those ideas in their head, right? So it's not a stretch to believe that they might end up actually kind of trying to raise their children at some point with the same philosophies. So what you might end up having is a similar situation one day in school where, you know, you have a science class trying to teach the globe earth theory, and you have a child standing up and not believing in the same theory, right? Which could cause controversy, right? In the school system, similar to, I don't remember the exact case, but similar to the evolution case.
Versus
right?
creationism. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I do see that on a much more, which could actually cause some sort of national or international controversy, right? The other thing that I see in a more harmful aspect, also, like you said, is that we have people now who are also willing to fund. We also have outlets these days like crowdfunding. So even if you're not getting funded from like a big corporation, if there's enough people in the community willing to like carry out certain experiments, we could see independent funding. So to give an example, we actually have a guy that Brian and I have talked about before, this guy who poses as a daredevil. His name is Mad Mike Hughes. His main goal has been essentially he wanted to first build his own rocket and shoot himself up. And that was basically to create this publicity stunt to raise awareness and raise more money to eventually be able to build some sort of like giant weather balloon, or basically he wants to eventually get himself as far up into space or outer, inner Earth orbit as possible to be able to determine whether or not there is a curve or not, right? So also you have people on the other side of things believing that there's like this dome encasing our Earth, and they have performed experiments. Like they still somehow launch weather balloons and stuff, and like it never hits the dome for some reason. But the point is, that is where I can see on a much more extreme level people ending up hurting themselves, because a guy like Mad Mike Hughes, I don't know a lot about the guy, but I'm guessing from the interviews I've seen, doesn't really know a whole lot about physics. God bless the guy. He's willing to do like some of the craziest shit he can possibly do to get a little bit of publicity. But my point being is that like, if you have people who are willing to raise the money, who are willing to back someone who is crazy enough to try experiments like this, there is definitely negativity in the sense that like now you could be potentially putting someone else's life at risk. So I guess what I'm trying to say to wrap this up, and I know you wanted to say something, John, basically to wrap it up, I don't see this movement having an effect on the overall progression of science as a whole, but I do see the potential for harm in certain cases, like the softcore version I gave, where it's like you might end up having, because there is a growing community of people who don't believe this, might start, teaching their children the same thing, and then it ends up being controversial when it comes to the educational system. And I can also see it as an impact where it could potentially physically harm people. I don't think it's gonna
individuals.
I don't think it's gonna destroy half the planet, but maybe 5 or 6 morons who sorry, okay, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be mean, but I mean, you obviously know I'm biased here, but I could definitely see the potential for harm and disruption, but I don't see it being a great impact to our civilization's advancement. So that's where I'll leave it. And
I guess I should mention too that I agree in the sense that I don't I don't look at the beliefs of flat people who adhere to flat Earth type beliefs. I don't think that beliefs in and of itself are in any way inherently dangerous. I think I should point that out. So, I don't want to act as if I think that this is some kind of significant existential threat that society as a whole has to get involved with. Obviously, I don't believe that at all. Again, I do think, even kind of bringing up the point that you said, is that there has been things that have been harmful and that have happened in the name of science, and that doesn't necessarily mean that those things are done intentionally by any means, obviously. Not to say that, unfortunately enough,
a lot of people get hurt in the progress of science too. It happens.
So but Brian, I know you wanted to make a point, so I don't want to stifle you.
I think we might have beaten this horse to death, so to speak. I don't know. Yeah. Well, okay. Well, I'll just say this real quick. I was going to press Steve on why exactly he thought that it wouldn't hamper the overall progress of science and try to get an explicit answer. But instead of doing that, I'm just going to kind of throw out the potential counterexample that I have. I mean, if you look historically speaking at the progression of science, there are times when something has come along and just completely chucked the science train off of its tracks, right? I mean, we got this from a single individual. So there was a time we can call them the Ionian scientists. You can call them the pre-Socratic philosophers. You can call them whatever you want. But there was a group of individuals in the Grecan world that were Hellenistic world. Classicists will probably smack me in the mouth. I don't know my time periods, whatever.
And you would deserve it, Brian.
Yeah, I would deserve it. But, there's a time during which there were individuals who were practicing something, this is hundreds of years before the alleged birth of Christ. This is, in the time period we call BC. So there are a group of people before the time of Socrates, call them the pre-Socratics, and they were practicing something that we very often talk about nowadays as being science, okay? Because it resembles the scientific method that was really kind of culminated by the appearance of Newtonian mechanics, or at least by that time frame. And so we had the pre-Socratics, the Ionian scientists, and then this guy Aristotle comes along and it wasn't just Aristotle's fault, but I mean he was kind of the guy who threw this off the tracks, right? You had this guy Aristotle come along, brilliant guy, probably one of the most brilliant human beings to have ever existed, but all of his science is just way off. It was just wrong, right? It was just wrong. And the method that he used to go about his scientific inquiries was not in any way something that we would nowadays call the scientific method, right? It wasn't completely opposed to science, but it wasn't a method that was conducive towards scientific discovery. But people believed Aristotle for so very long because he was so smart and so very influential. You had literally over 1,000 years of Aristotelian scientists until finally we had what was called the scientific revolution, and we got back to those pre-Socratic thinkers, or at least I should say, at least in the so-called Western world. So that's a big break. And I know that, times are much different now. We've had the scientific method entrenched for much, much longer. But it would not be ridiculous to say that some movement could come along which is challenging the values of the scientific method. There could be something that comes along and throws it off the tracks again. It's completely possible.
Well, and I think even to further that, and I'm somewhat naive on this topic, but I think one of the examples I've used of more modern day times in that realm is the idea of like stem cell research, and how for a long time in the United States they wouldn't push, stem cell research because of the religious belief associated with abortion and things like that, and using fetal tissue for those kinds of things, where obviously in other countries they weren't that didn't necessarily adhere to those beliefs. They were diving into these things, and they've seen tremendous progress with stem cell research in a lot of different areas. So I think you can definitely see even how, maybe not on mass scales like maybe we've seen in the past, but on more policy wise, or how policies and beliefs of specific societies can impact specific areas that could potentially be extremely beneficial to society as a whole, but because of the beliefs that we hold, people don't want to dive into those realms or dive into those things. I definitely think like I said, I think there's smaller examples maybe that we have seen, but maybe because they're more modern and we've, or they've happened within our lifetime, we don't see them in that same kind of light.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point to bring up. I don't know. We might be beating this question to death at this point.
Well, I think the other hard part, we're also kind of tackling a very difficult conspiracy. Mm-hmm. Off the bat, and they only briefly mention this in the documentary, but from everything that I understand about flat earth is, I guess that's also one of the reasons why I don't see it at this point really affecting the overall progress of science, is because there's still a lot of infighting and disagreements about the flat earth theory in general. And, Brian, the only reason I said earlier when you called it the Flat Earth Society, and I said just, call it the community or whatever, is because of that point. Like, there is definitely a organization called the Flat Earth Society. Mark Sargent himself has basically branded something called the Flat Earth Army, but even within that, nobody is 100% agreed on a unified theory of flat earth, and like, I think I've used this comparison before when talking to people. It's the same as like, it's not the same thing as like if a Hasidic Jew meets a Roman Catholic, mm-hmm. and you could have a conversation with them, and there are these, we're talking about devoted mm-hmm. folks to their religion. It's not like, where the Hasidic Jew can say like, well, we believe in X, Y, Z, and a Roman Catholic can say, well, we believe in ABC. Like, the flat earth community is extremely unorganized. Like, the only thing that they agree on is that the earth is not the shape that we've grown up to believe that it is.
And I'm glad you actually brought this up, because I did not realize that was actually a thing. And when I actually researched this documentary, I actually found a whole bunch of just like reviews on Google that were calling the documentary fake and things like that. So it's this weird thing where even the people in the community actually they don't trust one another. So I have this Google review. I just want to read it really quick.
Yeah.
All right. It's about the documentary that we're discussing. It's hilarious. I think it's hilarious because it just kind of shows this bifurcation where you have, I think, on one side, extreme conspiracy theorists, and then you have on the other side, maybe more scientific-minded people. Maybe that was unfair, but I'm going to read this review because I think it's a fun review.
Yeah, please.
All right. So this was posted by something called the Limitless Channel, and this is what it says. This film was a mockumentary, not a documentary. The actors in this film are in no way real flat earthers. This attempt to have the public believe that this group of bad, failed actors were in any way truth researchers fell flat on its face. I find it so hilarious the lengths that the government and fake news networks will go to hide the truth from you. The truth is that the earth is flat and more of a spiritual simulation than a physical spinning ball in endless space. The evidence is in the Holy Scriptures. There are true researchers out here, and we do not consent to any of this documentary. Please reach out to us. I'm not going to read the rest, but yeah.
Well, who are we to argue with spiritual scripture?
Whoa. So here's the thing that's wild, right? Is in that documentary, you have a bunch of people yelling conspiracy theory, the government's hiding all this stuff up and doing all, X-Files, right? You just got X-Files. Mm-hmm. And then you have a whole it's like meta X-Files. You have a whole new group of people who are like, oh no, even those people yelling X-Files, they're X-Files too, right?
Well, I think that they even explicitly say that there's people who believe that the main people that they're highlighting in the documentary are CIA active members who are out there to mislead and
Spread
misrepresent
disinformation.
Right. So yeah, I mean, even within the community as in and of itself, there's conspiracies built on conspiracies.
Yeah, and I don't know if you guys remember, there's one point in the documentary where I don't even know if Mark Sargent or Patricia Steele were involved in this, but it was basically like a Q&A, like public forum that was being held, and someone spoke up and said something, and they were going off in a specific tangent and belief about flat Earth, and one of the moderators or panel members had said, like, I think the biggest problem within the community is that, like, we're focusing too much on like that, I don't know how to say it. We're focusing too much on specifics here. Mm. We should be focusing more on just the fact that the earth itself is flat, and that's where we need to find our common ground, and that's kind of what builds the community. So, to that point, it's just like there is so much infighting and dispute about that whole fact.
But is the fact that there's this accusations and this extreme bifurcation in the community, is that a product of just the story that they're peddling? Or is there something else going on? Because I kind of think it's a product of the story that they're peddling.
I agree, but to be honest with you, I think, and again, this is gonna sound somewhat, I think, like I'm throwing a blanket over the whole community of it itself, and I don't mean to do that, but I think it speaks more to the individuals within the community and on a personal level, and I think here's ultimately what I mean by that is if you look at like a lot of these individuals, or I don't want to say, but at least some of the ones that were highlighted, it's not just a distrust in whether the earth is flat or not. It's a distrust in all standard teachings.
It comes back to education.
Right.
A lot of what I think the bigger conspiracies are these days are all directed, whether you're a flat earther or a 9/11 denier or a truther. Mm-hmm. It seems like the one common thread between all of them, they would all agree it has to do with distrust in authority and distrust in their own educational system. Go ahead.
And I think to even build off of that, I think that to me is an interesting question to dive into in turn. And I think the documentary did this somewhat, but to me that shows that maybe this isn't necessarily. I guess I'll word it like this: the people that are involved in this community, these aren't beliefs that. They're picking up these beliefs within the community, but it's their personality traits that are leading them to it, if that makes sense.
No,
they
I
are
agree.
distrustful.
Yeah.
And it's not the society that is making them distrustful. They were distrustful from the get-go.
Yeah.
And this community echoed those same kind of beliefs.
Right.
I would agree with
here's-
that. No, I was just gonna say that. I mean, look, obviously it's conjecture, but from what I see, I think John's kind of hit the nail on the head there. Right? You have people who
Isn't
have.
John great?
He is great. You have guys.
I try.
You have guys, individuals, human beings. You have people who there are certain kinds of characters, right? And okay, I'm gonna get. Probably, if anybody listens to me, whatever. I'm just going to say this. I don't have to qualify things. I'm not apologizing, right? You have, for this long ass time, people telling people, for a generation at least, parents telling their children, you can be anything you want. And it's like, no, you can't. You can't be anything that you want. And,
You don't learn that until you're old enough to realize that I can't have everything I want.
Unfortunately, that was shitty advice, unfortunately. But
Thanks, Mom and Dad.
I think there are just certain types of characters who have just, so I kind of look at characters almost as being trees, right? Where certain trees just do better in certain environments. It's just it's the nature of that kind of a thing. I just believe personally that there are certain types of people that flourish better in different scenarios. And I think it's the type of people who have certain personality traits that tend to be more receptive to these kinds of things that really kind of do well or are drawn to things like flat earth. And then like John said, since everybody in the community is saying the same thing, it's just reinforcing that belief over and over again.
I agree. And the only thing I want to say to your point, especially like going back to the, mom and dad tell you can be everything. This is more of just a general statement. But do you remember like a majority of Mark Sargent's portion of his interview was taking place at his mother's home? Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you remember this, but I got the vibe that it's like his mom is like totally not in agreement with him.
Right.
Like if anything,
She dodged the question when they asked her about it.
Yeah. And if anything, like God bless her, she was trying to be supportive of her son and his path as possible, but she did not look even like the most remotely on board with she didn't look like she was on board with what he was selling. And also, I know, Brian, you made the comment peddling too. I just want to say that I think, again, one of the problems with this specific movement is that I think, yes, some people are definitely hucksters in this. Like I'm just going to be straightforward
hold on.
here.
Just real quick. Maybe peddling was not the right word. I don't know if I want to say that they're charlatans. That is not
Right.
what I meant to say.
But here's the thing. I think, honestly, some of them probably are. They're feeding into the movement and using it to kind of, I guess, part of it is just be part of that community. But also, I think that there are definitely some people out there, even some of the people who have a voice, who truly 100% believe it. But I'm just being honest here. There are some people that I believe in that community, some of the influencers who don't believe for a second what they're selling. Now, I'm not going to name anyone specific. Like, I'm sure, I'm not saying that Mark Sargent is selling us a bunch of crap, but I will say this. One of the overall impressions that I got from this documentary, again, is like, number one, it's heavily community based. But number two, I don't know if you guys felt this way, but especially with Mark Sargent, we heard a lot less about the belief system of Flat Earth, but there was a whole lot of Mark Sargent talking about himself and his own influence in the community. And I'm not saying the guy's narcissistic, but what I am saying is what I picked up from a lot of that documentary is what fuels certain influencers in the community, I think, has more to do with the fact that, again, they're already kind of outcasts from the beginning. They're already questioning things, and they found something that they have a voice in, and that to them is actually more important than the theory itself. And I can go into specific examples if you want, but I'll give you guys an opportunity to jump in now, because I definitely have certain things that I can think of that I think would support my point. But to sum it up, I think what's more important to certain people in that community is not so much the specific belief system, again, which is why there's so much disagreement and not a conclusive theory about Flat Earth. It doesn't matter if you believe that there's a dome or just an ice wall or like the Earth pond theory or whatever. So much as it just matters that you're part of a community. For specific people, they're not only a part of the community, they have a voice. And for someone like Mark Sargent, who's been given a lot of credit for this movement, whether he started it or not, I think he feeds off of that. And I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that he's a narcissist. I'm just saying that from what I took from the documentary, a lot more of it seemed to be focused when talking to him about his personal, like, achievements in the community. And the fact that it's like people recognize him, and that seemed to like excite him a lot. And people, there's these shots of him at the Flat Earth conference of like people just giving him stuff. Like, I think for him, it's more about that recognition and being a part of something than it actually is to the actual science or the actual devotion to what he's preaching.
I agree. And it's interesting because I think, going back to, even discussing kind of his mother and kind of her, excuse me, her take on it. I think it's very interesting when you look at it from, again, the benefits that, Mark Sargent as an individual has gotten from being part of this community, which I think is probably somewhat of his mother's apprehension and even discussing it with him. Presumably made a career off of this. In addition to building a career off of it, he's gotten notoriety off of it. In addition to, that, he has a community, he has friends, he has relationships, and all of those things.
He
outside
even has enemies within the own Flat Earth community.
Right. And I think it's one of those things where if you take away what the community is arguing or what their view on the world is, I think from a societal standpoint, that's typically what people want for the people that they care about. They want them to be passionate about something. They want them to be successful in whatever endeavor they're trying to achieve. And they want them to have close relationships within those areas. And I think that's, again, part of what could somewhat fuel that echo chamber is even people from the outside saying, if you're happy, I'll leave it alone. One of the things I do want to point out, which I think is interesting, even kind of the discussion that we've had, is when we frame, I think our framework, the framework in which we're looking at this too, mirrors there's a lot of similarities in other religious beliefs, the communal aspect of it, the echo chamber aspect of it, the rewards of having that belief system, which to me is a very, very interesting way of observing this community. And I say that because when I look at the science community, which I think Flat Earth is attempting to
be on more of a scientific belief as opposed to a religious belief, you don't see that as much. You don't see the, all of the, I'll use physics as a reference, but you don't see all of the, quantum physicists getting together and saying, this is our belief and we're only going to stay within our bubble and only believe these things. And, I think it's a very interesting dynamic. And again, we're talking about it from the standpoint of this belief system. Belief implies that it's something that can't be proved, that, or there is not sufficient evidence enough to prove it, which again, I think even if you look at kind of the more scientific realm, and again, I could be off base on this, but I don't look at science as much as a belief system, as much as here's what the evidence is showing us. We could be wrong about that, but the evidence is leading us to this conclusion as opposed to the evidence is making us believe that this is the case.
Right. Well, and just to piggyback off of that, I think a lot of that also has to do with the fact that if you are actually a scientist, not just like hobbyists like we are, you also understand that while the objective of science is to separate fact from fiction, scientists themselves have to be subjective.
Right.
Because there's some great interviews in the past, obviously, from like Brian Greene, and also one of my favorite physicists who's beginning to be very popular right now, Brian Cox. They've both said before.
Whoa, Brian Cox, the guy from Sunshine?
He was an advisor on it, yeah.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
Brian Cox. All right, sorry, keep going.
Well, no. Just a side note, Brian, if you have not seen some of the recent Rogan podcasts, he had Brian Cox on the show.
That was a good one.
And
I gotta listen to that.
He talked about this on Rogan's podcast, and Brian Greene from one of his books is
Brian Cox, you mean?
No. I know. I'm talking about two different Brians.
Okay.
Brian Cox said this on Rogan's podcast. Brian Greene, I remember reading this in the book, both said something very similar, where they've talked about theories such as string theory. And the main point that I'm bringing up is the reason that we look at things like this is because we have the math to prove it. However, we cannot physically replicate it.
We can't observe it.
That is why, we cannot observe it. We cannot physically replicate it. That is why it is still a theory. So it is something important to look at, but that is also the subjective part of science, right? Whereas what you have, I think, with this growing community of flat Earth, you lose a little bit of the subjectivity. Everyone looks at these things more objectively, even though they are divided about their different theories of flat Earth. They are looking at it through objective goggles. Whereas, like, I think, in my opinion, as a scientist, you are trying to reach something objective, but you realize that you have to be subjective. Right. If that makes sense to either of you.
I don't know if I agree with you on that. So let me just I want to be clear on what you're saying before I try to push back. Are you saying that the flat Earth community has objectivity as a are you saying that they are closer to an objective approach than string theorists are?
I think maybe the way I should phrase it is that they are much more hardened in their belief system than a scientist is.
So you're suggesting that this flat Earth society is more dogmatic than the scientific community. Okay. I understood you incorrectly then.
Yeah, I think that while the goal of science is to obviously, again, separate fact from fiction, they have to be somewhat subjective until they can reach that conclusion. Whereas, again, going back to this documentary, like we talked about way earlier in the podcast, And something that they actually said in the documentary, one of these scientists or science writers said, is they have a way of looking at things where they already have their end result and they work backwards from there to prove it.
Right.
Whereas like in the scientific community, you might still have kind of like this end result, but it's a theory.
Okay.
And they're trying to work to that theory.
So
Trying to gather the other evidence to prove it as opposed to trying to make the evidence prove it.
Yes.
yeah, what you're basically accusing flat earthers of, well, in logic, usually it's called begging the question. It doesn't mean what it means in common parlance, but begging the question is kind of starting from a conclusion and then working backwards, where, of course, doing the scientific method is starting with your evidence and working toward a conclusion. So you're basically suggesting that they're just begging the question, right? They already assume the veracity of the flat Earth, and now they're just searching for the evidence to already support that.
Yes.
I think, again, you've dove into this way more than I have, but I would just want to push back on that just a little bit from I was listening to a Flat Earth podcast, and I believe it's called The Flat Earth Podcast. I was just doing it this morning, and I don't remember their names. There are two individuals that host the show, and they were talking about how they came to believe in flat Earth. So they started off, of course, as they call us globers. They started off as globers, and then they ran into these bits of information that did not make sense with how they understood the world at that time. So, for example, the one guy, I think he talked about, he asked the question like, well, how could a pressurized system exist in a vacuum? Earth is a pressurized system, space is a vacuum. How could that happen?
I've heard this argument, yes.
Right, and he didn't quite understand, which I could actually try to answer that question if you want. But anyways, he didn't quite get it, right? It didn't seem to make any sense to him. Understandably, it does seem weird, on the face of it. If you come up to somebody who does not seem to have a conceptual understanding of the way physics works, and you say, well, how does a pressurized system actually exist in a vacuum? You go, ooh, that's a great question. Who has an answer for me? And if you don't find any answers, then you start. So it seems more like, for me, at least for these individuals, these two specific guys who were doing this podcast, they had bought into the glober theory or the round earth theory. And then there were anomalies in their web of belief. There were anomalies in their worldview that they could not account for. And it was those anomalies that made them make a leap. And it was a leap. I do think it was a leap. But they made the logical leap kind of from the globe to flat Earth. Now, the thing that I'm pushing back on you is I'm saying that I don't think they're starting with the assumption that the Earth is flat. What I think they're doing personally is they kind of start off with a globe-centric view, with a glober view, and some bit of information comes into their worldview. They cannot account for it for whatever reason, and then they make this big logical leap. Okay, well, it doesn't make sense. I don't think it's a globe, so it's got to be, something else for them, flat Earth, right? So that's still a big leap, right? Like, okay, this little bit of information doesn't seem to make sense in my systematic worldview. Throw the worldview out and replace it with something else. That's a terrible logical move.
No, and I was going to say, and in the psychological realm, I think this is something that I know I have a tendency to see quite often, and I think this kind of summarizes it. I think with the way we're biologically kind of inclined to process information, we're constantly trying to make sense of what our surroundings are showing us, and we can only make assumptions based off of the evidence that we're given. For the majority of us, that is, what we can physically see, touch, taste, smell, that kind of thing.
Direct
the unfortunate
realism.
part about that is obviously what we're observing isn't always the truth. But unfortunately for, I think, the vast majority of people, because of the way we process information, if the conclusion that we're given, or if the answer that we're given doesn't fit our, what we're observing, our initial jump is, well, that doesn't make sense. Our natural inclination is to try to make sense of it. So we try to force things into that model. And you see this even on behavioral levels. I mean, you see people who, they misinterpret situations, but it's because their brain's trying to make sense of a situation and put all the pieces together, even though they're coming out with a conclusion that is very off base from what the reality of the situation actually is.
And I agree with that because I think, yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that's another part of that movement, because touching on what we said earlier too, is that, you're also talking, it seems, a lot about people who are joining the community who already kind of view the world in a different way. One of the things that was briefly mentioned in the documentary that I've also seen in other videos that I've watched or researched is you'll find that most people in the flat earth community undoubtedly say the reason they got into flat earth was because, quote, I was trying to debunk it. But my observation, or rather my theory with that, has always kind of been that's all well and good, but I question what your belief system has always been in the first place, meaning, like, have you always kind of felt like something? I don't know how to explain it. Like, I kind of feel like in order to, like, it's all well and good that, like, you started off, like, basically what you're saying is, like, you started off objectively enough, and then, like, you found all these missing holes. But I feel like in order to really get into this belief system, you kind of already have to have distrust in the first place. You know what I mean? And maybe that's really quick. Sorry.
No, you're okay.
Maybe that's because, coming from my perspective, I know I get into a lot of conspiracies and stuff, and maybe if a flat earther is actually listening to this, they're going to say, well, that's your problem. I've been indoctrinated already. But I've never once questioned the physics of of space and our solar system and our galaxy. I've never once questioned how gravity works and where we are as a globe.
Really?
In, like, the grand scheme of things.
You never once took a moment and thought, is this shit real? Is this real? Is this shit real?
I have when it comes to quantum theory.
I mean, yes, but I don't know. I guess the point I'm trying to make is, like, I question a lot of things, but I don't really question the shape of the earth. Let's put it that way. So that might be, like, a bad way to explain it, especially to, like, flat earthers. But the bottom line is, I feel like in order to, like, get indoctrinated into this thought process, whether or not you started off, like, trying to debunk it or not, might be slightly relevant, but ultimately I think, like, you had to be kind of in a certain mindset and questioning certain things from the beginning. And it's kind of like one of those, like, ideas where it's like, I wasn't looking for flat earth found me. That's kind of like what I'm saying. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Well, and I think it's interesting because I think when it comes to kind of like things like this, and going back to kind of the comment of, I got into flat earth because I was trying to debunk it. I think that the questions that the flat earth community asks aren't ridiculous questions. And I think that that's the difficulty of it is, and not to say that they don't ask some questions that you might look at and go, okay, well,
what
you know.
separates us from supposedly the rest of the animal kingdom is our ability to be curious and to intellectualize certain things. So go on.
So, and I think that that's a big part of it is if you dive into any community, especially like that's based on those kind of beliefs, they're going to pose questions to you that there might not necessarily be, if not, there might not be answers that are either observable on a daily basis, or there might not be answers that are that fit into, you know, what your worldview is already. And I think that that's part of the way that you kind of get sucked into it is, and I think even kind of like asking the question, like Brian, you posed at the podcast you had listened to it ask is, how do you form a vacuum in something that doesn't have a vacuum? Or I forget the specifics of it. That's a genuinely interesting question. And like you said, there's an answer to it, but I don't know what the answer to that is. But if somebody poses that question to me and then they give me an answer to it, well, it's not possible and somebody made it up. There's some people who could look at that and go, oh, okay, that makes sense. Like, because they're providing an answer to a question you didn't even know existed. It's kind of like that. I mean, as cliche as a statement as it is, but it's that you don't know what you don't know kind of situation. Really quick, and not to dive like too far off the flat Earth topic, but this was kind of like one of my biggest takeaways from the documentary, and I thought it might be kind of an interesting area to dive into. But one of the things that they posed at the end of the documentary was, again, this kind of harbors back to what we discussed earlier in terms of these are just these are everyday people. There's nothing different about flat earthers as opposed to us or anything like that. To me, the biggest kind of focus, or the biggest thing that I kind of focused on was, where am I a flat earther? And I think that was one of the questions that one of the person that they interviewed asked at the end of the thing is, what biases do we have where we're so kind of entrenched in the belief that we have an inability to look outside of it? I know that's kind of like a more personal question, but I thought it might be a different or an interesting area for us to dive into more on a personal level.
No, that's good.
So, and I mean, I guess, in my thinking about that, I mean, I think, and Brian, I know, obviously off, away from the microphones, you and I have had discussions about things, but I think I definitely have political biases in terms of how I process things. And it's very difficult for me to shake those interpretations of how I view the world and how I view society. And it definitely, it does become a cultural thing. It does become a social thing when you kind of get entrenched in it. And it does feel, when, I challenge those beliefs or I am confronted with my own kind of biases and I start to look outside of the, community in which I have kind of connected myself into, there is a sense of, am I abandoning these beliefs? Was I wrong this whole time? Mm-hmm. Without obviously diving too much into my personal, political beliefs and ideologies and things like that. I feel like that for me is one of the biggest, flat earth. That's my flat earth. That's my area where I've always struggled to kind of look outside of it. And I've always felt like, here's why I'm right. And here's the evidence that I have to support it. And don't look outside of that evidence as much as I feel like I should.
There are definitely things that I'm probably more open to talking with you guys about, but definitely certain beliefs or things that I think of a different way than like the majority that, like I said, well, I'll talk to you guys about it because you guys are my friends, but like, I'm not going to talk to other people about it because not necessarily that I'm embarrassed by it, but again, it's like, it's a belief system that I have that, I know could be like challenging for like other people to see it and talk about it in like a non-confrontational way. There's definitely things that, that I think about that I think I have a different view on. That's, I don't want to hash it out with
right.
people, so.
You don't want to do it live on a or not live, but record it on a podcast.
No, we could talk about it. I mean, of course, I'm mostly thinking about conspiracies because there are certain conspiracies, like I said, that I definitely look at and think like, there might be something to that. But it's not something that I'm going to talk about with someone else just, even getting to know them, even if they might bring it up, I might not bring it up either, because again, I, like you're saying, that's kind of like my flat earth in the sense that, like, if I'm going to bring this up, I know, number one, that I'd be making myself vulnerable. And number two, there are very few people that are willing to just talk about it either calmly or in a non-biased way. Because what we know at the root of every kind of conversation and argument is like, I have a point A, you have a point B. And from my experience, it's like, even when you and I, John, argue about things or converse about things, at the end of the day, neither one of us, we might like make each other think of something that we haven't thought about before. But at the end of the day, like, you still kind of walk away with your belief. I walk away with mine. And like, there's no, like, it's just, I don't know.
The question really is if you two are having a conversation in which John claims A and you claim not A, you give support for your side, John gives support for his side. Is there any way in which you would be amenable to reforming your position, right? I mean, if John presents enough evidence, would you be willing to abandon? Like, okay, so you said that certain conspiracy theories are kind of like your flat earth, but are they? I mean, are they? I mean, if John came up, so let's say that you think that the moon landing is fake. I'm not saying you do. I'm not saying you don't. But let's say that John comes up and shows you just overwhelming evidence that so you bring up all these things. Well, explain this, John. John explains it. Okay, well, explain this, John. John explains it, right? Is there any way that John could convince you that the moon landing actually happened? And if there is, I question whether or not that really could be your kind of flat earth, because it almost seems to me, kind of going back to what we said before, there's a certain amount of dogmatic faith, there's a certain amount of commitment here to this idea that the earth is flat, where you could present things like scientific information, things that they claim to value themselves. They performed their own scientific explanation or experiments, and those experiments suggested the inaccuracy of their worldview, and they just dismissed it more or less. That is so that kind of a commitment, that kind of entrenched, that kind of, let's say, encapsulated belief where it's insulated against other things, that I have a hard time saying that that's your flat earth. Just like I kind of have a hard time saying that politics is John's flat earth, because there's a willingness to be able to go outside and look at it from a different perspective that honestly I just do not see. Granted, right? I'm not part of this community. I have not known about this very much. I have literally watched one documentary and listened to 3 podcast episodes. But just from that very limited sample size, and this is a terrible argument, this is a hasty generalization, right? But the hasty generalization I'm going to make is that from that very small sample size that I've taken, it really does seem like you cannot convince a flat earther that the earth is not flat. Yeah. So it's basically an axiom that they've taken for granted.
No, I see what you're saying, because you're right. I mean, and I'll admit this. Yeah, if John and I were in a heated argument that we strongly disagreed on both ways, of course, I'm going to be honest and say that I'm naturally going to be inclined to staunchly trying to prove why I believe, you brought up the moon landing, so we'll just go with that. I'm going to be inclined to try and argue on the side of why the moon landing is fake. But you are right. If John presents me with enough things that I don't have counter arguments to, because let's be honest, in an argument, you're always looking for a counter argument too. If I can't, if he stumps me and I can't argue it, at the very least, yeah, you're right. I've done this before in conversations that we've all had. I will be the first to go, I don't know. And but I'm not saying that like I'm going to submit to your belief. I will go and try and look it up. But to your point, Brian, about the flat earth, I like to believe about myself that if I am kind of at a loss in an argument about a belief of mine, I don't just look for things that will support my argument. I really do think that I try to look at everything from both sides. And I could be completely wrong. That could just be what I think about myself. But one of the things that, I think, especially because I am in our friend group, probably aside from Nick, like I'm known as like one of the conspiracy buffs, but one of the reasons that I think separates me from being considered like, I don't know, on the fringe or being like a nutcase or something is that I really do try to look at everything objectively. I try to look at both sides of the argument before I really kind of form an opinion. So I guess you're right. I guess I couldn't necessarily say that is my flat earth, but I guess that's definitely like the closest thing I can think of to it.
I think that's the challenge of that question is like I guess even kind of after having a second to reflect on what you said, Brian, as well, it's tough to figure out what it might be. Because like I said, I think all of us have our things that we're so steadfast in our beliefs that nobody can shake us. But with that being said, I think it's difficult to maybe identify what those things are because you dismiss everybody who confronts you with any kind of evidence to the contrary, And again, I think, to be honest, I think that this discussion could dive into more of like human behavior and things like that I don't think, at least in my posing of the question, I didn't intend it to go, so I don't want it to. But again, I think it's a very difficult question to ask, and I think to be insightful enough on that level isn't easy for a lot of things. And I think part of the reason that I posed it too is part of the reason why I think, and even watching the documentary is. Do you believe the people who adhere to these beliefs think that they're? Do you think that do you think that they believe that they're objective? Or do you think that they know that they are as rigid as everybody presumes them to be?
I see what you're saying.
I think, again, small sample size, hasty generalization. And again, I don't really want to blanket everybody like we've been saying, but from watching the documentary and kind of listening to the few podcasts that I've listened to, it's tough because I think they are actually coming from a very critical perspective. I mean, I think they started off with a worldview that was given to them that they did not challenge initially, right? We said A is true, thus A. And they kind of went, oh, okay, A, and they went about their lives. And then something came along that said, well, wait a minute, A doesn't make sense. And that got the ball rolling. They start thinking, they start going into the stuff. So I really think like that's critical thinking, right? That is using logic. They're not being illogical there. It's more of like that leap then. Okay, well, all right, well, maybe this isn't true. So it must be that this other thing is true. And it's like, whoa. Mm-hmm. How did we make that jump? Yeah, I don't know. Steve, do you want to jump in on this?
I think one of the hardest things really for me to wrap my head around is so going back to the documentary, kind of going on that process where like, again, you start to question certain things. And then you find like-minded people, and then you kind of, start following based on like your certain belief system, or you get wrapped up into a community. Honestly, aside from all of that, that's okay. Don't worry about it.
Is that a cat or is that John?
No, that was John. That's so there's one thing that kind of makes me raise an eyebrow in the sense of the documentary. And again, I'm not blaming Mark Sargent. I'm just looking at it from my own perspective of how I kind of intellectualize things. So the guy obviously generated a following, and he's called the father of flat earth, but we also saw in the documentary there are other people that have been preaching this for a while, but for whatever reason, he's the one that gained the notoriety, and he's like the front man for this whole thing. He also is the one that spearheaded this flat earth conference. Now, I know I'm going in different directions, but try and stay with me here for a second. They started this conference. You obviously have to pay to get in, like most conventions and things. But where I guess the pieces don't fit to me is that when I look at a guy like Mark Sargent and I look at the theories of flat earth that have been presented as a whole, what I see is this guy who honestly knows nothing more about flat earth than I do. So if I'm in the community, right, I'm compelled though to possibly pay money to go to a conference to meet other like-minded individuals. But like ultimately what I'm paying for is to hear a guy talk about something that he knows very little more about than I do. And to me, I guess I'm just throwing this out there. Like, it's hard for me to wrap my head around because like when I look at these theories and things that I'm interested in, the only reason that I would go and go to see someone speak at a conference or something like that is because I'm looking at someone that I believe is like an expert, and what quantifies being an expert or qualifies being an expert in my mind is someone that knows something far more about the subject than I have. And my reasoning for this too is when you look at a guy like Mark Sargent, from the point that he kind of became famous on YouTube and kind of like grew this community, he has not presented, in my opinion, anything new. Or really, like, the documentary focused more on like the community aspect. There was no actual talk in terms of like major scientific advancements in this whole flat earth movement. So it's hard for me to wrap my head basically around the idea that, anything more than like you may be like going to a conference or a meetup like that just to be part of that community. Outside of that, it is really hard for me to understand why someone might like pay to go see a guy like this who, like I said, really, and like they preach it themselves. We're not scientists. We're just everyday people, and we're trying to show you that everyday people can prove this shit with everyday observable experiments. Like, what is the draw?
I think here's kind of my perspective on that. And I don't think that is I don't know if I'd necessarily call it a phenomenon, but I don't think that's a behavior that's unfounded in other areas. We all have a tendency to do that, I think, in my opinion, and maybe to varying degrees in terms of, I like to think if the people that I'm gathering information from or getting information from about the topics that I'm most interested in are people that do have some kind of, they do have something to offer me in terms of something I might not know, or, they're giving me information that I wouldn't have got otherwise. And again, I think that's it. Whether it's a conference or a book or another podcast or just the news at night or whatever it is, we all look to our outlets that, we see fit to provide us with information that we might already know. But again, it's kind of like the, I don't know how best to describe it. We all look for the outlets in which, okay, we know this person's talking about something that I'm already interested in, but if they are giving me information, even if I already know it, it's still a way of
it's confirmation.
Right. And again, it's funny because I know I do this on a pretty regular basis, and my evidence by it is, if I listen to a podcast or if I read a book that's by the same author that's close to the same subject, and obviously not verbatim, but I can usually surmise to a certain degree what their perspective will be on a given topic, just based off of either past times I've heard them speak about things or, past books I've read of theirs, or, and I think one example even comes up of a podcast I was listening earlier today where it was an interview podcast with two people that I've listened to individually before. And the podcast was basically them discussing views that I've heard them discuss before, but I was still listening to it. It didn't offer anything new to me where I was like, oh, well, that's different.
Well, but here's my question. Would you go pay money to go see them talk about something you already know and you've already heard of before? Like, if you knew that they were coming to Cleveland and they were literally going to just be discussing the same thing you just heard on that free podcast, or even if it's a paid subscription, I mean, would you still pay money to go see them? I mean, I guess that's the other aspect too, is there's that, we see it in the documentary, this aspect of Mark Sargent being a celebrity. But again, and it's just my way of thinking. Either one of you, please disagree with me. I just feel like, why would I go? It's basically like what you and I are talking about now. If for some reason you got extremely, you got a bunch of publicity for this very podcast that we're recording right now, and a bunch of people were paying you to, be at this conference and speak. I mean, other than the fact that you're my friend, I don't know why I would pay money to go see it, because you're already talking about stuff that, like, know more about than I do.
And Brian,
I'm not going to get anything from that.
And Brian, please feel to jump in, because here's the only connection that I can make. It's the equivalent of like going to see a concert of a band that I really like, but I already have the live album. It's the experience of going, the community aspect of it. Again, going to be around, people who are all, I'll say there's a difference between listening to a record through my headphones and listening to a record when I'm in the room with the band. I feel like that, and again, I could be wrong, but I feel like that's a portion of it. And I guess, Brian, what's your take?
No, I understand.
Well, I'm on board with you with the analogy with music. I think that's a good analogy to make, because there is a big difference. I saw, so I like Neil deGrasse Tyson. I don't like all of his views. I don't particularly like his view on philosophy, for example, but I have great respect for Neil deGrasse Tyson, and I've read some of his books. I've seen, of course, his, I've listened to Star Talk. I've seen his version of Cosmos. Like the guy quite a bit, but it was, so he came when I was teaching at Kent State. He came to Kent State to do a presentation, and it cost money. I think, I can't remember if it actually cost money or not, but whatever. It at least took time to go see the guy speak, right? And you kind of think, is he going to say anything new? Well, I actually think, when you, one of the great marks of, I think, someone progressing in his or her thought is that opinions do change and different ways of explaining material come out, right? And going to see Neil deGrasse Tyson live was absolutely fabulous because his energy and his charisma was just off the wall fantastic, right? He had a Q&A at the end, and Kent State was literally trying to get Neil deGrasse Tyson to wrap it up, and he wouldn't do it. And he's kept going on with the Q&A, and finally there's this one kid at the microphone, and some people from Kent State kind of walk walk out on the stage, and Neil goes, no, no, no. And he jumps off the stage and he grabs the kid and he brings him up on stage and he gets down on one knee and gives the kid the microphone and is like, what's your question? You know, it was great, right? It was wonderful. You know, it was a whole show, right? You wouldn't get that just from, you know, sitting at home watching Cosmos or, you know, whatever. So there is definitely a big difference in a live experience. The other thing that I wanted to say real quick is just that I do like going back to people, specifically people I do not agree with. So as John, you know, we've had a conversation about Jordan Peterson before,
right?
Where initially my reactions were not of the highest quality to his academic. Yeah, not a big fan. I've actually, since then, spent time listening to him have conversations with other people. So not just listening to his books or listening to just him do his own lectures, but actually listening to him have conversations with other people like Sam Harris, like Joe Rogan, who will actually push back on some ideas, especially Sam Harris. So, you know, they did that podcast.
Those ones are interesting.
Yeah, they're very interesting. So the way that he got pushed back on by other people made him explain things in different ways that started to click. And I'm like, oh, shit. Okay, well, that makes way more sense if I go back and I listen to... So I've been actually listening to 12 Rules again, like with a better understanding of where he's coming from. And I got to be honest, I like the book more now. But it's that kind of also like... If you hear someone once, or if you listen to something once and you don't like it, you don't go back to it again, then fuck you kind of thing. You got to ruminate on these things. You've got to, you know, be willing to go back to it. But also, if you listen to someone and you like someone, you know, why stop there, right? I mean, that person might have, you know, so I really like this guy named Dan Dennett, right? He's my favorite living philosopher. I watch a lot of his lectures and stuff. And, you know, people sometimes ask me, well, why he's explaining the same thing, just two different lectures. Why are you doing it? And I'm like, well, one, because the way he explained it in the first lecture isn't as good as the way he's doing it in this new one, and it clicks more. It makes more sense. Though, you know, the examples are better, or whatever it might be. So I think there is real value, one, in going and seeing something live, and two, either reading something over and over again, or participating in something over and over again, or watching someone talk about the same shit over and over again. Because from my own personal experience, from having to teach Aristotle time and time out, from having to, you know, or from being someone who's interested in Dan Dennett and wants to watch all of his lectures and all that stuff, you pick up on new stuff. You always are learning new stuff the next time you read Aristotle or the next time you watch Dan Dennett, right?
I think, honestly, you know, I know we used Flat Earth as kind of a platform, but I think we're getting into some things here that deserve like further exploration, which, as much as I wish that we could keep kind of going into, we're kind of coming up on a pretty lengthy segment. So why don't we maybe just try and kind of wrap this episode up? We can totally get back into this next week if you guys want to. We don't necessarily have to keep going from the flat Earth angle, but maybe we'll just keep exploring. Okay?
I just want to do one thing before we leave. Right?
Yeah.
I just want to do one quick thing. All right. I want all of us to kind of just real quick give a couple of factors that would make you lean toward flat Earth. Like, what are the couple of things that would have to happen to shake up your worldview enough that you would lean toward flat Earth?
Okay.
Why don't you go first, Steve?
Oh, man.
Well, if you don't have, I thought you were the most conspiracy theory prone.
Yeah,
I thought
I was
you'd
gonna
be
say
the most
that.
ready.
I am, but I gotta be honest. I don't know.
All right, well, I'll go first then.
Here. Let me put it this way. Okay. This is what I can say, because this is something that they didn't talk about in the documentary, and we could get deeper into like the theories behind the different beliefs of flat Earth. But some of the things that I'm interested in, as I've learned different things about flat Earth, is number one, you have all these different beliefs, right? So what I would like to know specifically from flat earthers that may kind of make me bat an eye or something is like, okay, you have some people who believe that we're encased in a dome, like like think about like a snow globe or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
The things that I think about are like, okay, who built the dome? Can you explain to me who built the dome, how it got built? Maybe there's something behind that I haven't heard yet that might make me be more interested or shift my belief. Secondary, same thing. Ice wall, right? Some people believe, okay, no dome, but like there's an ice wall, and maybe beyond that ice wall, nobody really knows or talks about it. The closest theory is that there's something called like basically pond earth theory. So like we're encased in an ice wall, and like the ice keeps going, and then like around our areas there's also little ponds of different earths and land masses. You know, if you could explain to me like what's beyond the ice wall, or what evidence you have of other earths or other theory. I know, Brian, you and I briefly touched about this because I showed you this really weird map, but there's this map that flat earthers use of like the same theory. It's like there's a flat earth, and then there's an ice wall, and then beyond that there's like these other land masses surrounded possibly, again, who knows, by a dome or another ice wall. If someone could tell me or show me a book or something that says, oh, well, the reason we believe that there are other land masses beyond this is because we've seen this and that happen, and here it is, you know, like tell me about these other lands. Right now you're only theorizing that like we're encased in an ice wall and there's other lands beyond this earth, or beyond our known continents. Show me the evidence. Show me, you know, what even remote, even if it's just something tiny, something like a fragment of an element that someone discovered on Antarctica that shouldn't be there, or it's something that we have not seen on our known continents. Like that might make me, I suppose, kind of give those theories a chance.
This is a tough one because the cliche, well, I don't want to say cliche, the obvious answer is evidence. But like I think to go even further beyond that, I think it's not necessarily just like evidence, because you could look at, okay, the picture of the pictures we have of the Earth clearly show that it's round. Now, obviously, there's,
if you believe that they're actual pictures,
right? Unless they're painted or whatever it may be. I don't know. I mean, I think the easiest, I think the only way that could get me to believe it is to not show that there's necessarily evidence, but that these theories, or that the results of these theories actually can be displayed in things that we use on not a regular basis, but things that we use. And here's kind of my example, but I'll use, even like if you want to look at like Einstein's, theories of relativity, and the idea that time shifts depending on how strong the gravity is. That's testable based off of, not just the fact that Einstein said it, but it's observable through the fact that they have to, make different time calculations for satellites than they do on Earth, or that, you could set a watch on top of a skyscraper and one on the ground, and there'll be, as slight as it is, a time differential between the two. You can see the actual, you could see the theories actually breeding results that you can say, okay, now I can see this. If flat Earth was to have the ability to give me something like that, then I think it would be a lot more persuasive in terms of like going, oh, okay. And I think that here's kind of, at least for me, the big downfall of why I think flat Earth isn't necessarily something that I find particularly appealing, is because they do that process backwards, in my opinion. They'll show, this is the way things work. This is how this is how it would work if the Earth were flat, as opposed to this is the theory of what we have. Let's see if this works.
In other words, you're talking about theories that can actually be tested and kind of proven.
Right. And I think like here's, I mean, and again, I think it goes even more like, I think here's like a good example of one, but if you look at like gravity, for example, how do we know that gravity is a force pulling down instead of a force pushing away? So how do we know that we're being pulled down to the earth as opposed to pushed down to the earth? We don't, but there's theories that say that we're being pulled towards the earth, and there's science that could prove that those theories. So I think if the flat earth theories were able to give me things like that, and then I could see the evidence behind why it works, I think I'd, and again, I don't necessarily if I'd go, okay, that makes sense. But again, I think that, you know, my initial even kind of thought when you brought up this question, Brian, was, you know, the question I posed earlier was, what is our flat earth? Maybe round earth is our flat earth. You know what I mean? Maybe we're so rooted in this belief that no evidence on the contrary would we be able to look at and go, yeah, that makes sense. You know, I don't know. It's a very difficult question to answer.
Well, I actually think that it's possible to sway me over to flat earth, but I just think it would be insanely hard. I think really, so here's the problem of even motivating me, to getting me off the ground to start being extra skeptical of the global model. You have to motivate why. You have to motivate me why it is that so many scientists, and we have a history dating back to at least the use of the gnomon by the ancient Greeks at sea trying to calculate ships at a distance, why they calculated for a curvature, right? And were able to, like, you have to explain to me why those people who had no reason to be lying, why they were lying, why modern day physicists are lying, why NASA is lying. Like, you have to motivate to me why this is actually a conspiracy. Like, you have to explain to me the value of trying to deceive people into believing that the earth is round. Because the sparse examples that I've seen, such as, they've had this for 500 years, so of course it means everything to them. No, that's not an argument. That's not even a logical connection. You gotta, like, how, why, right? Another one that I can think of off the top of my head is in the podcast they were saying something about how it's easier to control people on a globe, and again, why? How does that make sense? Like, you have to be able to you have to be able to motivate why it is that there's actually some sort of fraud going on and why that fraud is being perpetuated, right? A logical reason that is independent of any sort of presumption that the earth is indeed flat. So that's what you've got to start with me, right? That's how you're going to start chiseling away at my armor. After that, it's just about empirical verification. If you can motivate to me the conspiracy theory, I'll start listening. And then if you can show me tested hypotheses that have been reviewed by independent parties that actually show that there's no curvature, that actually show that all these things are indeed correct from the flat earth perspective, then yeah, you could sway me. You could theoretically sway me.
I could probably explain to you on the next episode, of course, the whole idea for globe earth control or domed earth control, but we'll save that for the next one. Good question though, Bri. Good way to end it.
Absolutely.
All right,
great.
So thanks for letting me join you guys. I appreciate the conversations.
You coming back next week?
I plan on it. I might have a 3-year-old hanging on my leg when we do it, but we'll get through it.
Yeah, he'll be fun.
We'll see about that.
But absolutely, it was a pleasure, guys.
Thanks, Johnny.
Hey, thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening again. If you joined us this week, I'm Steve-O.
I'm Brian.
I'm John.
And we will see you next week.